Some of you might have noticed the left's weird split personality when it comes to mental illness. On the one hand, they seem keen to label the concept of mental illness as being oppressive and wish to do away with the concept altogether, but then on the other, they're weaponising it for political gain. So first of all, let's have a look at the cases where they see mental illness diagnoses as oppressive and incorrect and doing harm to people. You're smiling away there.
You're so right there, because I remember when I was editing Labour Party conference and they were like, I'm neurodivergent, and neurodivergent people need to have more, prominence in society.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were going to make an all-autistic shortlist for candidates. so genuinely, yes, it is a political weapon, like being a woman.
Yes. So the skepticism towards mental illness has existed for quite a long time now. So there's a famous book published by Thomas Szasz called The Myth of Mental Illness that argues that mental illness doesn't exist all the way back in 1961. So this is going all the way back to sort of cultural changes of the 60s. So yes, as with many phenomena, it has its roots in the 60s. But what we're going to be looking at is something a bit more recent than that. This is an article from The Guardian that's 9 years old that is titled, "Medicine's Big New Battleground, Does Mental Illness Really Exist?" And this outlines some actually quite good stuff, as well as making some absolutely insane arguments and getting some stuff categorically wrong.
I mean, as an absolute layman on this subject, I would have thought this would settle science. Like, I would have thought that mental illnesses were pretty, a thing.
Yeah, like
Are they not?
The person that smells like stale urine on the bus that's talking to themselves, I don't think they're healthy.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are literally nuts, and I thought that was just a settled thing. Is it not?
Well, to some people, it's not settled. To most clinical psychologists, they're like, yeah, obviously mental illness exists. You belong in an asylum.
Okay,
if you argue against it, really.
So you got leftists being like, no, this is perfectly normal behaviour. Like, okay.
Apparently so. So it says, obviously this is from 9 years ago, the latest edition of the DSM, and they say the influential American Dictionary of Psychiatry, it's not a dictionary, it's a diagnostic manual that they actually use to have a list of all the traits of the symptoms. But inaccuracies aside...
Is that what the D stands for?
Yes.
So I think it's not dictionary then.
Yeah. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's
not dictionary and statistical manual.
Says that shyness in children, depression after bereavement, even internet addiction can be classified as mental disorders. It's provoked a professional backlash with some questioning the alleged role of vested interests in diagnoses. And this is actually a valid conversation. Like, some things are being over-medicalised, and I'm actually very sympathetic to this. However, you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater just because there's some weird stuff in there. Doesn't mean that, schizophrenia is perfectly normal now. Fine. Like, it's its own kind of madness to say it's not. So critics claim that the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, increasingly voluminous manual will see millions of people unnecessarily categorised as having psychiatric disorders. For example, shyness in children, temper tantrums and depression following the death of a loved one could become medical problems treatable with drugs. So could internet addiction. But they also miss out the fact that quite often, if you have a problem with these things, it's the person who has the problem that seeks out help. These haven't just popped up out of nowhere. These are things that people are going to health professionals with problems for. They don't just go out and just grab people at random and say, we're going to test you for new psychological disorders. That's madness. So they say, inevitably, such claims have given ammunition to psychiatric critics who believe that many of the conditions are simply inventions dreamed up for the benefit of pharmaceutical giants. And, there is some sort of back and forth between the medical world and the pharmaceutical giants. I'm not going to deny that, and it is kind of worrying. However, there are some things where people actually do need treatment, and some treatment is better than nothing at all.
I like you're saying this like it's a radical position. It's just like, maybe we should treat patients. I don't know.
It's becoming a radical position. And it goes on to say, a disturbing picture emerges of mutual vested interests of a psychiatric industry in cahoots with Big Pharma, as the writer, John Ronson, whose work I quite enjoy, only half joked in a recent TED Talk. Is it possible that psychiatric professions have a strong desire to label things that are essential human behaviours as a disorder? And I think that there is actually a case for this, like over-medicalising young boys, giving them Ritalin and stuff like that because they're hyperactive. Well, that's just boys being boys to some extent. Obviously, there are some cases where it might be necessary, but it seems to be overdone. And then this article continues on.
You always notice when it's only the Americans who are having this problem, and everyone else in the world is like, no, it's just a boy. I mean, it does seem a cock-up.
Yes. And it goes on to say, and now in a significant new attack, the very nature of disorders identified by psychiatry have now been thrown into question. Not really, but if you say so. In an unprecedented move for a professional body, the Division of Clinical Psychology, the DCP, which I hadn't even heard of until this, which is a bit unusual as a psychologist, but which represents more than 10,000 practitioners and is part of the Distinguished British Psychological Society, will tomorrow publish a statement calling the abandonment of psychiatric diagnoses and the development of alternatives which do not use the language of illness or disorder. So yes, this is exactly what I was getting at, that labelling things that are clearly abnormal has now become a problematic thing. It goes on to say, argue that things like the language used are arcane. However, of course, it's attacking the biological understanding of mental health as well, because apparently biology is not compatible with being left-wing.
Also, who cares if it's ancient language? Like, it reflects reality. Again, like, this is a medical field, right?
Yeah.
Like, you wouldn't ask doctors, like, stop saying your patients are crippled. I was like, but they're crippled, mate.
What they're missing here as well is that the diagnostic manuals that they use for this are just intended as tools to observe behaviours as objectively as possible. So they have a list of certain behaviours, and then it's down to the discretion and the experience of the health professional, then use that information accurately. They could say, well, maybe you have this, maybe you don't. It's just another tool in the repertoire to make it less subjective and more objective, which surely you would want if you don't want the personal biases of the clinical psychologist coming through, would you? So the reason for me putting this together is this recent article in the New York Times titled, "Doctors Gave Her Antipsychotics. She Decided to Live with Her Voices."
What?
Does this seem like a reasonable...
So she's a psycho.
Yes.
Who hears voices telling her to kill again. And I don't know if that, I made that up.
So the byline...
So she was given drugs to stop that, and she's like, no, I quite like him. He's a good guy.
So the byline in the article says, a new movement wants to shift mainstream thinking away from medication and towards greater acceptance. So here we go. Are you bigoted against people who hear voices?
I told you, man. I remember, I think we did a segment about it, where they were saying, if people who have... voices in their heads, that's actually different genders, and therefore
yeah,
this is...
did.
So I told you, it's becoming a thing.
So it goes on to say, Caroline Meze-Carlton began hearing voices when she was in daycare. Mornings, by the time she was in middle school, I'm going a bit mad just reading this, a bowl of oatmeal awaited her for breakfast, next to a white saucer full of colourful pills. Her voices remained vibrant. They weren't within her head, they spoke and screamed outside of her skull. They belonged to beings she could not see. That's not really true, is it? It was obviously in her head. The voice who had been with her the longest warned of catastrophes coming to a family in Zionsville, a town north of Indianapolis. Calamities tied in some unspecific way to TV images of the Gulf War. Fighter planes, flashes in the sky, explosions on the ground, luminous and all-consuming. A woman's voice castigated her at school, telling her that her clothes smelled and she had better keep her hands down, no matter whether she knew the answer to the teacher's questions. Another voice tracked her every move, its tone faintly mocking. She's getting out of bed now. Oh, she's walking down the hall now. So, yes. Does this sound like something you would want to live with?
No, I also don't have that. And I think someone who does is probably abnormal.
Yes, and they probably should be helped. The article then goes on to say that she self-medicated with things like heroin. Kind of indicative of a problem, isn't it? And then she got in
medication.
And then
I'm medicating. Sorry.
She also got in trouble with the police multiple times. So I think this is a classic case of someone who actually does need clinical help. I mean, if you're taking heroin and getting arrested,
You're just quirky.
I feel like you need help. Funnily enough. So yes. There are also other things. So a tool doctors use every day can perpetuate medical racism. And this tool is having the fact that the patient's race is listed in some medical forms close to the top. Because, of course, there are things such as sickle cell anemia that affect specific races, and therefore profile of someone's race is important. And this is why clinicians like to use it, because it works.
I just love that we interact with America so much in this regard, because that narrative is exactly the opposite in Britain, which is that because we don't talk about race in the medical world, people are missing. So, for example, during COVID, or the fact that you can't see conditions the same on the same skin tone, like it's different, it looks different, the colors are different. And therefore, the NHS is racist because it doesn't teach people to take race into account. Whereas in America, they do, and then that's racist itself.
So yes, apparently these labels could reinforce racial biases and prevent patients from receiving standard medical treatments, according to the Scientific American.
It helps them. Like, we know we can help you with your illness.
Yes, and this, of course, is infecting academia as well. Here it's talking about using a transdiagnostic perspective to disrupt white supremacist applications of the DSM, the diagnostic manual. So,
yes. So that lady who was hearing voices were actually being white supremacist by saying that maybe she should take some drugs.
Well, they're basically arguing that the academia and the clinical psychology in its current form is disproportionately labelling Black, Indigenous people of colour as violent and severely mentally ill, and therefore white supremacy. It's not that it's observing an objective trend and these people need help. No, it's because we're racist.
It's not disproportionately there. It's active where it is active. And therefore, you go and look for it. I mean, you remember the Amber Heard trial? There was that psychologist who was being grilled, and they were like, don't you say they're disproportionately diagnosed in women? It's like, no, it's more prevalent in women.
Yes.
That's simple.
I mean, that's like saying, well, autism is, more common in men. This is because of male biology, not because of any other reason. But you're like blaming it. Yes, it's just...
It's feminists who are keeping a brother down, telling me I should be looking at the trains, but I really like the trains.
So yes, you have this on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have people weaponizing mental illness. So here we have kind of the quintessential leftist, Owen Jones, using mental illness as a weapon for political ends. Parents who refuse to affirm their LGBTQ+ children risk inflicting terrible lifelong harm on them, putting them at heightened risk of poor mental health and developing problematic relationships with alcohol and other drugs. It is child abuse, and this is in response to an article, I believe, by The Telegraph.
If you don't want to trans a 4-year-old, you're abusing the child.
Yes.
No, I think Owen's abusing the child.
Well, of course, yeah. But yeah, this is the other side of the coin where they're using it as a political weapon. So you can move on to other things, such as this article by Vice. Is racism a mental illness? Well, according to Vice, it is. Of course, all of these clinicians that write for Vice clearly
are not mentally ill themselves.
So they say, on the Oprah Winfrey Show in 1992, Jane Elliott, the educator known for teaching students about prejudice by biasing them against blue or brown eyes, came to incisive conclusions about racism.
That sounds like a really funny job. Like, what are you doing today? I'm making the kids racist against the brown eyes.
I think it was used as sort of a case study in psychology. I'm familiar with what they're on about anyway. And they use a quote here saying, "What we're dealing with here is mental illness," she said. Members of the audience started clapping. "Racism is a mental illness. If you judge other people by the colour of their skin, by the amount of chemical in their skin, you have a mental problem. You're not dealing well with reality." But of course, considering that everything is called racist these days, it's like, oh, milk, that's racist, isn't it?
So if you believe in milk, you're mentally ill.
Yes.
You're seeing things.
Also, aren't the left the ones that are raising racial consciousness? On the right, people just wanted to judge people on who they are as people.
Not how black and woman they are, which was the standard of Supreme Court justice.
It's a very weird self-own in a way, isn't it? So
we're all mentally ill. We know you are. Get lost.
And then we have institutions like the National Centre for Biotechnological Information, quite a prominent institution, having articles here. Is extreme racism a mental illness? Yes.
It's extreme racism.
I don't know. Do you have like a snowboard, a skateboard?
Radical racism. I don't know.
Who knows? But yes, there's also, this is just at a local news level here, refresh takes. Both racism and racial trauma lack an official mental health diagnosis. I don't know why the Buffalo News feels the need to get involved in this, but I thought it was amusing.
Presumably because of the recent shooting, but the fact that that gives them some kind of knowledge on what mental illness is. I don't think
Well,
follows.
that's what I mean. Yeah. It's not necessarily their motivation to look at it, but that I imagine the journalist here talking about it has no inkling of what it actually means to, diagnose these sorts of things. So it argues that currently racial trauma, the mental injury caused by encounters with racial bias, he's talking about it like it already exists as well. Like this is already an established thing, guys. Discrimination and racism is not acknowledged by the DSM-5. Anika Olson, the Assistant Director of Policy Research at the Institute of Urban Policy Research and Analysis at the University of Texas, wrote in Social Work Today, what a mouthful this sentence is, before the latest editions, yet it's a phenomenon that has been extensively researched and painstakingly documented and is widely regarded by both mental and physical health practitioners as a serious public health issue. I don't think that's true, is it?
But I also love that we've got to the point now where the progressive worldview is that the DSM should accept that hearing voices is perfectly normal, but learning about crime statistics should make you mentally ill. It's like, okay.
It's madness, isn't it, of its own. Olson noted that anxiety and depression more than tripled in the black community from 8% in January 2019 to 35% by June 2020. But that's racism, isn't it? Racial trauma.
I feel like that's probably the lockdowns of BLM, let's be frank.
Yes. Studies, she wrote, always note that when they say studies or scientists say, the vagueness is a veil to be wrong, basically, have shown that black adolescents average more than 5 racial discrimination experiences per day, both online and offline, greatly contributing to depressive symptoms. 5 a day? Is that
Gonna
really?
get you 5 a day, I don't know. I mean, should we start knocking them down for every time someone's anti-white? Because, I mean, that's going to be higher than 5 a day.
Yeah, surely. Oh, but it's just absurd, isn't it? So will things get better? Well, the institutions that are sort of in charge of things aren't exactly on side with us, unfortunately. So here is the British Psychological Society hit with an article saying, British Psychological Society's response to the report on the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. This was a race report that was controversial in Britain for being factually correct. And the left really hated it, also because loads of ethnic minorities actually worked on it, so they couldn't call it white supremacy, but they did try and call them Uncle Toms and things like that. So yes, the British Psychological Society is a registered charity which acts as a representative body for psychology and psychologists in the UK, it's worth mentioning, and is responsible for the promotion of ethical practices in the sciences, education, and also they're known to provide awards and grants, and they accredit university courses as well, so they're not inconsequential. And they say here that in response to this race report, Diane Ashby, the Deputy Chief Executive of the British Psychological Society, said, the findings of the report represent a missed opportunity to identify the causes of disparities in our society, systematic racism, and to drive forward with a positive change the government said it wished to deliver. We are particularly concerned with the re-traumatising of the black, Asian and minority ethnic people through a denial of their lived experiences and will have an adverse psychological impact. As stated previously, we recognise that institutional racism exists. As an organisation, we will tackle it. We stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies in striving for anti-racist practice, and we are committed to tackling racism within our profession. We will not be complacent. So,
I mean, just on the first line, she's failed.
Yes.
It's like, the real causes of disparities in our society, systemic racism. Well, the report's finding, and the one you're most butthurt about, is that there was no systemic racism in Britain they could identify. They asked for evidence and no one provided it, and they went, well, there isn't any then, because we can't find it. And she's like, no, trust us. Even though the evidence says one thing, we've got our own ideas. Like, yeah.
Not only that, but
Science.
inconsistent with the actual evidence, they're providing diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism resources. So if we can have a look at that page, they have a whole page dedicated to resources that you can use to carry out this training. And they've got things like readings, podcasts, films, blogs, all sorts of stuff here. And yeah, they're basically facilitating leftism here. Not carrying on with their job, but the Americans as well, the American Psychological Association, have an article here. Apology to people of colour for the APA's role in promoting, perpetuating and failing to challenge racism, racial discrimination and human hierarchy in the US. That last one's an unusual one, isn't it?
I've never heard that before. Human hierarchy. Do they mean hierarchy in and of itself?
I think so. I'm only going to read a little bit because it's the whole thing's madness, and you will get the message here.
American Psychologists for Anarchy. I don't. Well,
The American Psychological Association failed in its role leading the discipline of psychology and was complicit in contributing to systemic inequalities and hurt many through racism, racial discrimination, and denigration of people of colour, thereby falling short of its mission to benefit society and improve lives.
I'm yawning just because it's so stock rhetoric, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's like, you could ask a bot to write this at this point. There's enough
You can
examples.
get like an AI-generated woke apology.
Yeah, I feel like that can be done. If there's any engineers, there's a job.
APA is profoundly sorry and accepts responsibility for and owns the actions and inactions of APA itself, the discipline of psychology, and individual psychologists who stood as leaders for the organisation and field. So this is it. This is the state of the mental health professions at the minute. It's a lot worse than I thought, actually, because I'm not a clinical psychologist. I tend not to dip my toes into this area. My goodness, is it mad. I mean, on the one hand, you've got people denying that mental illnesses exist. On the other, you've got people trying to say that racism is a mental illness and that racial trauma should be categorised as a mental illness, along with all these other things. So it's a very split personality on the issue, I suppose you could put it.
Stop taking the drugs, hear the voices. She's right, you do look ugly.
But yes, I thought it'd be important to draw attention to this. I know I've been laughing about it, but it is obviously horrifying, and I think it's probably going to deny lots of people who actually need help, the help they need, on the one hand, and then be used to weaponize these narratives that are unfounded in the actual data to then attack political opponents on the other. So there is a sort of dual-pronged attack on society in this domain, and I thought I'd draw some attention to it.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the content we have on the site, such as this article, Kamala's Fever Dream about the diversity hire herself. And if you want to find out what else we're putting out, you can follow us on Getter at @lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.